Today, I stand before you with a message that carries both urgency and gravity. Warning: Mr. Modi is in much deeper trouble than I anticipated. Rising discontent in India today is one of the most pressing political realities, and it is proving to be far more intense than many had predicted. At the heart of this discontent lies a widening gap between the promises made and the realities experienced by the people. When Narendra Modi first came to power, there was a wave of optimism. He was seen as the leader who would transform India, bring jobs to the millions of unemployed youth, support farmers, and create an economic environment where growth would be inclusive. For a time, this vision seemed possible, and people placed their faith in him. Yet over the years, the mood has shifted dramatically. Farmers, who form the backbone of the Indian economy, feel betrayed. The agricultural reforms introduced by the government, which were meant to modernize and streamline farming, instead triggered mass protests. Farmers feared losing control over their land and livelihoods to large corporations. What was supposed to be reform turned into a crisis of trust. The government eventually withdrew the farm laws after months of resistance, but the damage was already done. A sense of neglect and suspicion lingers, and farmers have not forgotten how their concerns were brushed aside until protests became impossible to ignore. This discontent has not only weakened Modi's rural support, but also ignited a broader discussion about whose interests the government truly serves. Youth unemployment adds another layer of frustration. India is one of the youngest countries in the world, with millions entering the job market every year. The expectation was that Modi's policies would unleash growth and create opportunities for this restless generation. Instead, many graduates and skilled workers find themselves struggling to secure even basic employment. The gap between qualifications and opportunities is leaving young Indians feeling excluded from the nation's growth story. Disillusionment is particularly dangerous among the youth because they carry energy, ambition, and impatience. Their discontent is not quiet. It manifests in social media campaigns, street protests, and a growing willingness to challenge authority. Economic hardships are also hitting ordinary citizens in their daily lives. Rising prices of essential goods, from food to fuel, are squeezing households. Inflation erodes the value of wages, and while official statistics may show growth, it is not growth that most families can feel. For the poor and the lower middle class, survival is becoming more difficult. For the middle class, aspirations of stability and upward mobility are fading. People who once hoped for a brighter future are now worried about making ends meet. This kind of economic stress directly translates into political dissatisfaction because citizens naturally hold leaders accountable when life becomes harder. Another dimension of this rising discontent is the perception that the government prioritizes image over substance. Grand announcements, slogans, and large-scale events may create excitement, but when results on the ground do not match the rhetoric, cynicism spreads. Ordinary Indians are becoming more vocal about this gap between words and action. In a democracy, perception matters, and once people begin to lose faith in the promises of their leaders, regaining that trust becomes incredibly difficult. Modi, once celebrated as a man of action, now faces growing criticism for being more focused on appearances than solutions. Furthermore, the discontent is no longer limited to specific groups. Farmers, students, workers, and even sections of the business community are voicing concerns. What makes this particularly dangerous for Modi is that these grievances are beginning to overlap and reinforce one another. A farmer struggling with low income is also a parent worried about a child's future. A young person unable to find a job is also part of a family feeling the pinch of rising prices. These interconnected struggles create a collective frustration that can become a powerful political force. Rising discontent is not only about statistics or policies, it is about emotions. It is about the feeling of being unheard, unseen, and unvalued by those in power. When citizens believe that their sacrifices and struggles are dismissed or exploited, anger builds. That anger, once widespread, becomes nearly impossible for any government to control. What began as scattered complaints has now grown into a broad mood of unease, and if this discontent deepens further, it could transform into outright resistance. For Modi, this represents not just a political challenge, but a crisis of legitimacy. India today finds itself grappling with economic struggles that run deeper than headline numbers suggest, and these struggles have begun to fuel widespread frustration across society. While government reports often highlight growth rates, infrastructure projects, or foreign investments, the lived reality for millions tells a different story. Beneath the surface of statistical optimism lies a far more complex and painful truth, one of rising costs, shrinking opportunities, and fading confidence in the promise of economic stability. At the center of this storm is unemployment. For a nation as young and ambitious as India, the inability to provide adequate jobs is not merely an economic issue, but a social and political crisis. Every year, millions of young Indians graduate from schools and universities, brimming with expectations of secure employment, yet many are met with closed doors, limited openings, or jobs that fail to match their qualifications and aspirations. Educated youth are working below their skill levels or joining the swelling ranks of the unemployed. When hope turns into despair, frustration grows, and that frustration becomes a dangerous force for any government to confront. Parallel to unemployment is the rise of inflation, which gnaws at household budgets in every corner of the country. Prices of food, fuel, and daily essentials have been climbing steadily, leaving ordinary citizens struggling to manage their lives. For the poor, every rupee matters, and when vegetables, cooking oil, or transportation costs rise, survival itself becomes precarious. Even the middle class, once seen as a stabilizing force in Indian society, is now under immense pressure. Monthly expenses grow faster than incomes, and families that once dreamt of progress now find themselves cutting back, worrying about school fees, healthcare costs, or simply saving for the future. The agricultural sector, despite employing nearly half of India's workforce, continues to suffer from chronic neglect and inefficiency. Farmers, who should be the foundation of India's prosperity, remain trapped in cycles of debt and uncertainty. Promises of modernization and reform have not translated into relief. Instead, many feel abandoned as crop prices fail to keep pace with rising input costs. A farmer struggling to make ends meet is not just facing an economic challenge, but is also questioning whether the government values his role in society. When the backbone of the economy feels broken, the whole system trembles. Small businesses and entrepreneurs, once hailed as engines of growth, are equally caught in a web of difficulties. Policy shifts, such as the sudden implementation of demonetization and the complexities of the goods and services tax, disrupted countless livelihoods. Many small traders, shopkeepers, and self-employed workers are still recovering from those shocks. Larger corporations may adapt and thrive, but the smaller players, who form the lifeblood of India's markets and local economies, often find themselves suffocated by bureaucratic hurdles and financial instability. Economic inequality thus deepens, leaving the gap between rich and poor wider than ever. Adding to this, foreign investment and big projects are often showcased as signs of progress, yet their benefits rarely trickle down to the majority. Shiny infrastructure projects and ambitious announcements cannot conceal the fact that millions of Indians still live without reliable health care, quality education, or secure employment. Growth, when concentrated in the hands of a few, ceases to inspire hope among the many. The promise of development for all begins to feel hollow when everyday struggles remain unchanged. There is also the psychological weight of economic insecurity. Citizens who once had faith that hard work would lead to upward mobility are beginning to doubt whether that path even exists anymore. Dreams of owning a home, starting a business, or providing a better future for children are giving way to worries about survival. This erosion of confidence is perhaps more damaging than statistics, for when people stop believing in opportunity, they lose trust in the system itself. The truth is that economic struggles are not isolated problems. They are interconnected threads that shape every aspect of life. Unemployment feeds frustration among the youth. Inflation burdens households, agricultural distress breaks rural India, and inequality sows division. Together, they form a picture of a nation under strain. A government may highlight its achievements, but citizens measure success by the stability and dignity of their own lives. When that measure falls short, discontent grows, and the pressure for change becomes inevitable. The image of strong, decisive leadership has long been one of Narendra Modi's greatest political assets. From the moment he rose to national prominence, he cultivated the persona of a leader who could cut through red tape, make bold decisions, and bring a new sense of purpose to Indian governance. This image not only earned him admiration from millions, but also positioned him as a symbol of hope for a country eager to break free from years of perceived stagnation and indecisiveness. Yet, in recent years, cracks have begun to appear in this carefully crafted image, and those cracks are becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. One of the most damaging blows to Modi's leadership image came from the handling of the farmers' protests. What was initially framed as a bold reform to modernize agriculture turned into one of the largest displays of public resistance the country has seen in decades. The government's refusal to engage meaningfully with farmers, followed by months of standoffs, created the impression of arrogance rather than strength. When the laws were eventually repealed, it was not celebrated as an act of compassion or wisdom, but rather perceived as a reluctant retreat forced by massive public pressure. For a leader who had built his reputation on decisiveness, this moment exposed vulnerability and fueled questions about his ability to balance firmness with empathy. The handling of the COVID-19 pandemic also chipped away at Modi's aura of control. While the initial lockdown was portrayed as a bold and necessary move, its suddenness left millions of migrant workers stranded, hungry, and forced to walk hundreds of kilometers back to their villages. Later, when the devastating second wave struck, images of overwhelmed hospitals, oxygen shortages, and mass cremation spread across the world. The government's lack of preparedness in the face of such a crisis deeply hurt Modi's credibility. Instead of being seen as the protector of his people, he was criticized for being more concerned with image management and political rallies than with urgent public health measures. Another area where cracks in leadership are evident is in Modi's reliance on centralized control. While decisiveness can be a strength, excessive concentration of power often leads to mistakes that could have been avoided with broader consultation. Many within India have begun to view his style as autocratic, where dissenting voices are silenced and decision-making is insulated from public scrutiny. This perception undermines the earlier belief that Modi was a leader for the people. Instead, he is increasingly seen as a leader who demands loyalty while discouraging open debate. In a democracy, such perceptions can be corrosive, gradually eroding the trust of citizens who once felt empowered by his leadership. The international stage has also reflected this erosion of image. While Modi was once hailed globally as a dynamic reformer, recent years have seen growing criticism of India's democratic backsliding under his watch. Reports of curtailed freedoms, the targeting of journalists, and the shrinking space for opposition have raised alarms internationally. These criticisms may not sway all domestic supporters, but they do tarnish the carefully cultivated narrative of Modi as a global statesman leading the world's largest democracy with confidence and credibility. Another visible crack comes from the gap between promises and delivery. Modi's political appeal was built in part on his ability to create a vision of a new India, one of prosperity, jobs, and dignity for all. Yet, as years pass and many of these promises remain unfulfilled, the image of the leader who gets things done begins to fade. People are no longer as willing to accept slogans and announcements without concrete results. What once felt like bold confidence now risks being interpreted as empty rhetoric. It is important to recognize that leadership images are sustained not only by achievements but also by public perception of humility and accountability. Modi's reluctance to acknowledge mistakes or engage openly with criticism has fueled the sense that he is out of touch with the struggles of ordinary Indians. In times of crisis, people often look for leaders who can admit shortcomings and connect with them emotionally. The absence of this quality in Modi's leadership style magnifies the cracks in his image. What makes these cracks particularly dangerous is that they accumulate. A leader's image does not collapse overnight, but once the sense of invincibility fades, the erosion becomes difficult to reverse. Each crisis, each unmet promise, each moment of perceived arrogance adds another fracture. For Modi, who has relied heavily on his personal brand as the cornerstone of his political power, the growing cracks in that image represent not just a challenge, but a potential turning point. India under Narendra Modi has faced a complex mix of international and domestic challenges that are testing both the government's capacity and the Prime Minister's reputation as a strong leader. On one hand, Modi has sought to position India as a rising global power, a nation capable of standing toe to toe with the world's biggest players. On the other, he has struggled to address deep-rooted issues within the country that threaten stability and undermine the very image he projects abroad. These twin pressures are converging in ways that make it increasingly difficult to maintain control and confidence. Domestically, one of the most pressing challenges is the erosion of democratic values. India has long been celebrated as the world's largest democracy, but under Modi's tenure, critics argue that the space for dissent has shrunk. Journalists, activists, and opposition leaders often find themselves under pressure or facing legal harassment. Institutions that were once seen as independent, such as the judiciary, investigative agencies, and the media, are accused of bending under political influence. For many citizens, this raises alarm about the weakening of the checks and balances that define a healthy democracy. When people begin to feel that their voices are being stifled or that criticism of the government comes at a cost, faith in governance erodes. This is not merely a political issue, but a structural challenge to India's democratic identity. Another domestic challenge is social polarization. Modi's political base has often been energized by appeals to religious and cultural identity, but this strategy has also deepened to violence. Reports of communal violence, religious intolerance, and targeted campaigns against minority communities have grown more frequent. While such tactics may rally sections of the electorate in the short term, they create long-term fissures that weaken national unity. A society where citizens feel excluded or fearful is one where stability becomes fragile. Modi's image as a leader for all Indians is increasingly overshadowed by accusations that his government favors majoritarian politics, an accusation that undermines his credibility at home and abroad. On the international front, Modi has made bold moves to position India as a key player in global affairs. He has cultivated close ties with the United States, engaged with powerful allies like Japan and Australia through initiatives such as the Quad, and sought to present India as a counterbalance to China's growing influence. However, this ambition comes with immense challenges. Relations with China remain tense, particularly after border clashes in Ladakh that left soldiers dead on both sides. The perception that the government did not adequately respond to these incursions has fueled criticism within India, raising questions about Modi's ability to safeguard national security. For a leader who thrives on projecting strength, the handling of China represents a significant vulnerability. At the same time, relations with neighboring countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan remain strained. India's regional leadership, once taken for granted, is increasingly contested as China extends its influence through trade, investment, and infrastructure projects. Modi's government often emphasizes the idea of India as a global leader, but when smaller neighbors drift toward Beijing, it undermines that vision. The inability to maintain harmony in the immediate neighborhood exposes limits to India's diplomatic power, no matter how grand the international stage appearances may be. Another international challenge lies in India's democratic reputation. Western nations and global human rights organizations have raised concerns about press freedom, minority rights, and civil liberties under Modi's government. While these critiques may be dismissed domestically as external interference, they damage India's global image. Modi wants India to be seen not only as an economic powerhouse, but also as a moral voice for democracy in the world. Yet, when India is ranked lower on democracy indices or flagged for rights violations, it weakens that narrative. International investors and partners watch these signals carefully, and reputational damage can carry real economic and strategic consequences. Economic diplomacy adds another layer of complexity. India's ambition to become a manufacturing hub and attract global investment competes with challenges of domestic instability, bureaucratic hurdles, and questions about long-term policy consistency. When international firms weigh these factors, some hesitate to commit. This creates a contradiction. India is promoted as a land of opportunity abroad, but many investors find that the reality on the ground is more difficult. The convergence of domestic unrest and international criticism puts Modi in a difficult position. At home, he must manage rising frustration over unemployment, inflation, and inequality, while also addressing questions of justice, inclusion, and democracy. Abroad, he must convince the world that India is both a reliable partner and a thriving democracy. Even as evidence suggests otherwise, each challenge feeds into the other. A government seen as authoritarian at home cannot easily present itself as a defender of democracy abroad, and a leader facing domestic unrest struggles to project unshakable strength on the international stage. Together, these international and domestic challenges reveal a fundamental tension in Modi's leadership. His style of governance, built on centralization, bold rhetoric, and the projection of strength, is now being tested by realities that demand nuance, humility, and compromise. The inability to reconcile these pressures risks deepening the cracks in both his image and his government's effectiveness. Accountability is the cornerstone of any democracy, and for a leader who has built his political brand on strength, decisiveness, and promises of transformation, it eventually becomes unavoidable. Narendra Modi's rise to power was based on the belief that he could deliver what others could not: jobs for the youth, prosperity for farmers, growth for the middle class, and dignity for India on the global stage. For years, his charisma and rhetorical mastery have allowed him to sidestep direct responsibility when outcomes fell short. Yet as discontent rises and promises remain unfulfilled, the demand for accountability has become louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. One of the central truths of leadership is that the higher a leader rises, the more responsibility rests upon their shoulders. Modi has consistently projected himself not merely as the head of a government, but as the very embodiment of a movement, a new vision for India. That personalization of power can be a strength in times of success, but it becomes a liability when challenges mount. If Modi is credited for every achievement, he must also be held accountable for every failure. Citizens are beginning to recognize this dynamic, and the pressure on him to answer for policy missteps, social unrest, and economic distress is growing. The farmers' movement is a striking example of accountability in action. When farmers took to the streets against the agricultural reforms, the government initially dismissed their grievances and painted them as misinformed or politically motivated. But as the protests swelled and gained national and international attention, the government was forced into an embarrassing retreat. Modi himself had to announce the repeal of the laws, a rare acknowledgement that the people's will could not be ignored. This moment signaled something important, that even the strongest leaders must eventually answer to the people when public anger reaches a tipping point. Accountability is also unavoidable in the face of economic realities. Youth unemployment, rising inflation, and widening inequality are not abstract problems. They are daily struggles for millions. When young graduates cannot find jobs, when families cannot afford basic necessities, and when small businesses collapse under financial pressures, no amount of slogans or speeches can substitute for tangible results. Citizens are increasingly unwilling to be placated by rhetoric. They want answers. Why have promised jobs not materialized? Why are prices rising faster than incomes? Why are opportunities concentrated in the hands of a few while the majority continue to struggle? These are questions that demand accountability, and Modi's government cannot indefinitely deflect them. The COVID-19 pandemic further exposed the inevitability of accountability. The devastating second wave, with its oxygen shortages and overwhelmed hospitals, left scars not just on families, but on the collective memory of the nation. The government's lack of preparedness and its focus on political rallies during a time of crisis drew widespread condemnation. For many Indians, this was a moment when leadership was tested and found wanting. Even among Modi's supporters, the belief in his infallibility was shaken. A leader who promised to protect and uplift his people was forced to face criticism for failing to anticipate and mitigate a catastrophe. That failure continues to haunt his government, and no narrative control can erase the lived experiences of loss and suffering. Internationally, accountability takes on a different form but remains just as pressing. As Modi presents India as a rising power and defender of democracy, the world watches closely. When democratic institutions appear weakened or when minorities face discrimination, global partners and observers hold the government to account. Reports by international organizations, criticism from foreign media, and rankings that highlight democratic backsliding serve as reminders that India cannot entirely control its image abroad. These signals matter not just for reputation but also for investment, alliances, and diplomacy. Modi must answer not only to his citizens but also to a world that increasingly expects India to live up to the democratic ideals it espouses. What makes accountability particularly powerful is its cumulative effect. A single crisis may be explained away, but repeated failures, unmet promises, and visible contradictions pile up over time. Each unaddressed grievance strengthens the public demand for responsibility. People begin to connect the dots: the economic struggles, the social divisions, the democratic concerns, and the leadership's apparent inability to address them effectively. At this point, accountability is no longer a choice, it is an inevitability. The essence of democracy is that leaders are servants of the people, not rulers above them. Modi's government cannot escape this truth. Power, no matter how absolute it appears, is ultimately subject to the judgment of citizens. Accountability ensures that promises are not forgotten, mistakes are not excused, and leaders are reminded that authority is temporary while the people's voice is permanent. For Modi, the reckoning may not come immediately, but it is approaching steadily. The deeper the dissatisfaction runs, the more forcefully accountability will assert itself. No leader, however powerful, can stand against the tide of a people demanding answers. The warning that Narendra Modi is in deeper trouble than many anticipated is not simply about one man or even one government. It is a reflection of the larger truth that no leader, no matter how powerful or charismatic, can stand above the people forever. Modi's current challenges carry a message that extends far beyond his political career. A message that resonates across India's democratic framework and offers lessons for all future leaders. This warning is at its heart about the fragility of trust, the limits of power, and the enduring strength of democracy when citizens demand accountability. For nearly a decade, Modi has been at the center of Indian politics, shaping narratives, setting agendas, and commanding immense public attention. His leadership style has often been marked by centralization of authority, reliance on personal charisma, and the projection of strength. This approach has undoubtedly yielded political success, but it has also created a dangerous dependency on one individual's image. When that image begins to crack, as it is now, the entire system feels the tremors. The warning here is clear: no democracy should be overly reliant on a single leader, because when that leader falters, the nation risks instability. The deeper message lies in the relationship between promises and delivery. Modi's political brand was built on ambitious pledges of transformation, economic growth, employment, national pride, and social harmony. Yet, as the years have passed, many of these promises remain unfulfilled or only partially realized. The disappointment among citizens is not just about one leader failing to deliver, it is about the erosion of faith in politics as a whole. When leaders overpromise and underdeliver, the public begins to see politics as a game of deception rather than a vehicle for progress. This breeds cynicism and weakens the democratic spirit. The warning beyond Modi is that leaders everywhere must treat promises not as tools for elections but as commitments to the people. Another lesson comes from the handling of dissent. Modi's government has often reacted defensively, even aggressively, to criticism, whether from farmers, students, journalists, or opposition figures. Attempts to suppress or dismiss dissent may provide short-term control, but in the long run they fuel greater resistance. Democracy thrives on debate, disagreement, and the free expression of ideas. When governments try to silence criticism, they only magnify discontent. This is not a lesson for Modi alone. It is a reminder to all leaders that dissent is not an enemy of governance, but a necessary component of it. Ignoring this truth risks undermining the very foundations of democracy. The warning also extends to the international stage. In an interconnected world, the image of a nation's leadership cannot be separated from the perception of its democratic values. Modi has sought to project India as a global leader, yet rising concerns about press freedom, minority rights, and institutional independence have cast shadows on that vision. The global community judges not only the words of leaders, but also the lived realities of their citizens. For future leaders, the lesson is unmistakable. Global credibility is built not only on economic or military strength, but also on the resilience of democratic values. There is also a generational dimension to this warning. India's young population is impatient, ambitious, and increasingly unwilling to accept excuses. They demand jobs, opportunities, and a government that listens to them. Leaders who fail to engage with the aspirations of this generation risk being left behind. Modi's struggles with youth unemployment and education are reminders that ignoring the needs of the young weakens not only political authority, but also national progress. Future leaders must understand that their legitimacy depends on the ability to harness the energy of youth, not alienate it. The warning beyond Modi is about humility in leadership. Power can create the illusion of invincibility, but history repeatedly shows that leaders who disconnect from the people eventually face a reckoning. Democracies do not crumble when leaders lose, they crumble when leaders believe they cannot lose. Modi's current troubles serve as a reminder that even the strongest political figures are accountable to the people. Future leaders who ignore this lesson risk repeating the same cycle of overreach, disappointment, and decline. The story unfolding in India today is not just about the fortunes of one man. It is a broader caution to all who aspire to lead. Authority is temporary, trust is fragile, and accountability is permanent. Modi's troubles may mark a turning point in Indian politics, but the deeper lesson is timeless. No leader stands above democracy, and no government can endure once it loses the confidence of its people. That is the warning beyond Modi, and it is a warning that every leader in India and beyond would be wise to heed.